The thing that won't let me sleep. What kept me up last night wasn't a breaking headline or a viral clip. It was a PDF, a dry, carefully worded ruling and a stack of hearing transcripts that, on the surface, looked like the kind of thing only lawyers and insomniacs bother to read. Buried in that paperwork were two names you probably know for very different reasons, Lindsay Halligan and James Comey. And I'll be honest with you, the way their paths just cross scare me more than any shouting match you see on cable news. Let me paint you a picture. It's late. The kind of late where your house is quiet, but your mind isn't. I'm scrolling line by line through this judge's opinion, then flipping back to a transcript of a hearing where Halligan is being questioned, her words under oath, recorded forever. On one side, you have a former FBI director who became a symbol, hero to some, traitor to others. On the other, a newly installed interim U.S. attorney with deep ties to Donald Trump's legal orbit. On paper, it's just another case. But it doesn't feel like just another case. What I'm looking at is the skeleton of how power actually moves in this country. Who gets charged, who doesn't, who is trusted to make that call, and what happens when those decisions become a personal weapon instead of a public duty. I've spent enough time around the system to know that the real danger rarely comes wrapped in dramatic speeches. It comes in the little deviations, the quiet irregularities, the corners that get sanded off the process because someone is in a hurry, or someone is angry, or someone thinks the rules don't apply to this situation. Most people will never read this ruling. They'll hear a headline, case against Comey dismissed, or judge blocks Trump-appointed prosecutor. It will get slotted instantly into red versus blue, hero versus villain, your team versus their team. But let me walk you through what hit me as I read. This wasn't just about whether James Comey did or didn't break the law. It was about whether the law itself is still being treated as a neutral system, or as a loaded gun we hand to whichever faction is most determined to use it. Here's what really scares me. I've seen this pattern before in smaller ways. A rushed indictment because a statute of limitations is about to expire. A politically connected appointee parachuted into a sensitive case. A judge asking a prosecutor a simple question, "Did you follow the proper process?" and getting an answer that makes the whole room go cold. When those moments are isolated, the system can absorb them. But when they start clustering around the same names, the same motives, the same vendettas, that's when you realize you're not looking at accidents anymore. You're looking at a playbook. The story that just surfaced about Halligan and Comey sounds technical. It's about appointment powers, grand juries, procedures, statutes, separation of powers, phrases that make most people's eyes glaze over. But process is not some boring side detail. Process is the protection. Those tiny, boring steps are the difference between a government of laws and a government of men. Change the process in the right places, and you don't need to announce a dictatorship. You just quietly tilt the field until one side never really loses and the other side never really wins. Now imagine this isn't about a former FBI director with every camera in the world pointed at him. Imagine it's about an ordinary citizen who annoyed the wrong powerful person. A local journalist, a whistleblower, a community organizer, someone who doesn't have a legal defense fund or a national platform. The same shortcuts, the same appointment games, the same casual attitude toward the rules, except this time, nobody's watching. That's the scenario that kept replaying in my head as I read those pages. Most people don't realize what just surfaced about Halligan and Comey because the system almost succeeded in wrapping it in legal jargon and moving on. But I couldn't move on. Not from a judge effectively saying, the person bringing this case may not have been legally in that position at all. Not from a transcript that raises more questions about how this indictment was put together than it answers. Not from the feeling that a line I always assumed was there, a line between politics and prosecution, had just been tested in a way we can't afford to ignore. So here's what I want to do in this video. I want to walk you through this step by step. Who Halligan is, how she got there, what exactly was done to Comey, what the judges actually said, and why this matters far beyond these two names. Because if you strip away the personalities, what's left is a basic, terrifying question. Is the law still a shield that protects all of us, or is it becoming a weapon aimed at whoever stands in the way? And I'll tell you this much, based on what I've seen and on what's in those documents, I'm more unnerved now than I was during some of the highest stakes briefings I've ever sat through. In the next, I'll explain why you should even trust my read on this, and what I've seen from the inside that makes this moment feel like a warning we would be crazy to ignore. Why you should even listen to me. Before we go any further, I want to acknowledge the question that's probably in the back of your mind. Okay, but who are you? Why should I trust your read on this? That's fair. In an age where everyone on the internet has a take, you're right to be suspicious of yet another voice telling you that democracy is in danger. So let me walk you through where I'm coming from. I spent a big chunk of my adult life inside, and just adjacent to the Justice Department machine. Not as a pundit, not as a commentator, as well the people who actually had to sign their name on charging documents, stand up in court, and defend the decisions we made under the glare of a federal judge who could end your case and your reputation with a single sentence. My early years were in a U.S. attorney's office, the kind of place where the hallways are lined with framed indictments and old trial photos. Later, I worked in and around Main Justice, and then as outside counsel on sensitive federal investigations. I've been in the rooms where people argue over whether to bring a case at all. I watched good prosecutors say no to their own bosses because the evidence wasn't there, or the timing stank, or the politics were just too close for comfort. Let me paint you a picture of one day I will never forget. I was still relatively young, a few years into the job. We had a case we were proud of, solid facts, sympathetic victims, a defendant we were sure a jury would hate. There was just one issue, a procedural step on how a key piece of evidence had been handled. It seemed minor. A deadline missed by a hair. A disclosure made a little later than it should have been. Nothing we thought that should derail the whole train. We walked into court that morning confident. We walked out feeling like we'd been stripped naked in front of the entire legal community. The judge, a seasoned, no-nonsense federal judge, zeroed in on that small misstep like a laser. He didn't yell. That would have been easier. He just started asking questions one after another, in that calm way that tells you he already knows the answers. Counsel, when did you receive this document? And when did you disclose it? Why did you think that was acceptable? With every answer, you could feel the oxygen leaving the room. It didn't matter that we believed the defendant was guilty. It didn't matter that the evidence was compelling. In that moment, what mattered was that we had treated a rule, meant to protect the fairness of the process, as a suggestion instead of a boundary. At the end of that hearing, the judge said something that seared itself into my brain. I'm paraphrasing, but this was the gist. The government does not get to decide which rules matter based on how badly it wants a conviction. Then he sanctioned us. Not just the office, the individual attorneys. Our names, our reputations, our pride. That day changed me. I walked out of that courthouse understanding something I'd only half believed before. Due process is not decoration. It is not a formality we drape over outcomes we already want. It is the protection. It's the only thing standing between justice and raw power. That's the lens I bring to everything I'm telling you about Lindsay Halligan and James Comey. When I read that an interim U.S. attorney with no prosecutorial experience was dropped into one of the most sensitive districts in America, my antenna went up. When I saw that she was a former defense lawyer for Donald Trump, and that she immediately went after two of his most prominent antagonists, my stomach tightened. When I read that judges were questioning whether the grand jury had properly approved her indictment, I didn't see technicalities. I saw the same bow. A dairy line that old judge had defended in my early case, being crossed again, but this time with far more at stake. You have to understand how the culture is supposed to work inside federal prosecution. Cases don't just materialize out of thin air. Before anyone stands up in court and announces, the United States versus John Doe, there are layers and layers of review. Line prosecutors assess the evidence. Supervisors push back. Defense arguments are anticipated and debated. And in truly sensitive or politically explosive cases, there are often internal memos, long, painstakingly argued documents, laying out the pros and cons of bringing charges at all. I've helped write those memos. I've watched them kill cases we believed in, because in the cold light of legal standards and public trust, the risk to the system was greater than the satisfaction of an indictment. In that world, timing matters. Motive matters. Optics matter, not in the spin doctor sense, but in the will the public still believe in this institution when this is over sense. You don't rush the flimsy case to beat the statute of limitations because someone in the White House is impatient. You don't swap out a cautious career prosecutor for a loyalist who's never run a case, just because you're hungry for revenge. You don't play games with grand jury procedure because you think the target deserves it. At least, that's what we told ourselves we didn't do. So when I tell you that what happened with Halligan and Comey sets off every alarm I have, It's not because I'm emotionally attached to either of them as characters. It's because I've seen what it looks like when the system bends toward integrity, even at a political cost. And this looks like the opposite. Here's what really scares me. The erosion never starts with the people no one's heard of. It starts with big, polarizing figures, names like Comey and Trump and Letitia James, because those are the ones that get their own side cheering. You can get away with bending the rules a little if your base is convinced it's payback. If they hate the target enough, they'll call any abuse of process justice. But the system doesn't know the difference between a good target and a bad one. Once you normalize the idea that an unqualified loyalist can be installed to bring shaky charges against a political enemy, you've written a template. And that template won't stay confined to the famous and powerful. Eventually, it trickles down. That, more than anything, is why I'm talking to you like this. Not as a distant analyst, but as someone who has had to sit across from agents and supervisors and say, no, we can't do that. Not like that. Not this way. I know what it feels like when the pressure is heavy and the clock is ticking and someone above you wants a headline, not a sustainable precedent. So if you hear a different tone in my voice about this story, that's why. This isn't abstract for me. It's not just about whether you think James Comey is a saint or a snake. It's about whether the culture I grew up in, the one where an old judge humiliated us for taking a shortcut, still exists, or whether we have quietly crossed into a new era where power writes its own rules and dares the rest of us to object. In the next, I want to step back and trace how we got here, the long tangled history between Comey and Trump, the grudges that never died, and the slow grinding build-up to this attempt at legal payback. Because once you see that backstory clearly, the Halligan episode stops looking like a one-off mistake and starts looking like the latest move in a very dangerous game. The long shadow of Comey versus Trump. To understand why Lindsay Halligan's appointment and the indictment of James Comey hit me like a warning shot, you need to understand the history between Comey and Donald Trump. Not the meme version. Not the oversimplified hero versus villain story that both sides love to recycle. I'm talking about the real, corrosive, unfinished business that's been simmering beneath American politics for nearly a decade, long before Halligan ever stepped into that courthouse. Let me walk you through this slowly, because the stakes only make sense when you see the whole arc. I remember the morning in May 2017 when the alert flashed across my phone. James Comey fired. I was in a conference room prepping for a different matter entirely when someone stuck their head in and said, "You're going to want to see this." And I did. Because anyone who worked near the Justice Department understood immediately, firing the FBI director wasn't a normal personnel decision. It was a shockwave. Most people think the Comey-Trump conflict began with that firing. It didn't. The roots go back to the 2016 campaign, the Clinton email investigation, the public statements Comey made that angered Democrats first, then the Russia investigation that turned Republicans against him. By the time Trump was sworn in, Comey was walking a tightrope, and he knew it. I've spoken with people who were in the building at that time, and the word they kept using about Comey's approach was institutionalist. Sometimes too much so. Sometimes not enough. But he believed in documentation. He believed in memos. And he believed that if something crossed a line, it needed to be written down. That habit, those memos, are a big part of why we're still talking about him today. Let me paint you a picture that still sticks in my mind. Comey arrives at Trump Tower for that infamous briefing about Russian election interference. The president-elect pulls him aside afterward for a private conversation, one Comey will later describe in painstaking detail. Think about the dynamic for a second. A former reality TV star turned incoming president, and across from him, a 6'8" former prosecutor who has handled mafia cases, terrorism cases, corruption cases. Two men who measure power very differently. After that meeting, Comey goes back to his car, sits down, and does something that made Trump furious later. He types out a memo. Not a casual note. A government document. A record meant to preserve exactly what was said and how it was said. Because in Comey's world, and in mine, documentation is how you protect truths that people might someday try to rewrite. When Trump asked Comey for loyalty, when he reportedly said, "I hope you can let Flynn go," when the tone of those early encounters slid from awkward to alarming, Comey didn't just rely on memory. He wrote everything down. He told his deputies. He followed a playbook that has saved many prosecutors and agents over the years. If it matters, write it. Here's what really scares me. That was the moment the long shadow began. A powerful man felt challenged, embarrassed, undermined by someone who would not bend. And if you know anything about Trump psychology, you know he doesn't forget slights. He circles them. He feeds them. He turns them into vendettas. After Comey was fired, he testified publicly before Congress. Calm, precise, almost clinical. He talked about Trump's requests, about those memos, about why he documented everything. And he made something else unmistakably clear. He believed the president had asked him to do something improper. I watched that testimony live, not as a Democrat, not as a Republican, as someone who knew exactly what those words meant inside the Justice Department. When a former FBI director says a president leaned on him to kill an investigation, that's not political theater. That's the kind of allegation that careers and countries pivot on. Trump, for his part, exploded. Publicly, repeatedly, ferociously. He called Comey a liar, a leaker, a criminal. He hinted at tapes that didn't exist. He demanded prosecution. He encouraged allies to go after Comey's credibility. And behind the scenes, based on accounts from people who were there, he repeatedly pushed DOJ leadership to revisit Comey's actions. This is where the tension hardened into something more dangerous. Not just anger, but the desire for payback. There's a difference between believing someone wronged you and believing the system owes you their head. Trump crossed that line early, and he didn't cross it quietly. Over the next few years, Comey became a kind of ghost haunting Trump world. Whenever new revelations came out about Russia, or Flynn, or obstruction, Trump circled back to him. Whenever the special counsel investigation intensified, the name Comey reappeared in Trump's public tirades. He wanted Comey charged. He wanted Comey discredited. And if people inside DOJ told him that the evidence didn't support prosecution, or that the legal standards weren't met, he dismissed them as weak or disloyal. Let me tell you something from experience. When a president, any president, fixates on a single individual as the embodiment of his grievances, the system starts to warp. Pressure builds. Careers end. People resign. And eventually, someone, somewhere, tries to give that president what he wants. Fast forward to 2025. Statutes of limitations were about to expire on certain potential charges related to Comey's congressional testimony. Previous DOJ leadership, under both Trump and Biden, had declined to prosecute. The case had been analyzed, debated, and shelved. That should have been the end of it. But the desire for payback doesn't follow institutional logic. So when Lindsay Halligan stepped into the role of interim U.S. attorney, pushed in after a cautious career prosecutor reportedly said there was no case, she immediately took up a mission that others had quietly, firmly declined. She indicted James Comey on counts that had been sitting dormant for years, on theories the DOJ had previously rejected, and on a timeline so tight it practically screamed urgency. Now imagine how that looked from the inside, from the vantage point of the men and women who had spent years telling their bosses that this wasn't a viable case. To see it suddenly resurrected, not because new evidence had emerged, not because the law had changed, but because a new, politically aligned prosecutor had been installed, that sends a message. A chilling one. The Comey indictment wasn't an isolated legal event. It was the culmination of a long-standing conflict, a vendetta that had been gestating since those early memos, early confrontations, early televised hearings. It was Trump's unfinished business finally wrapped in the thinnest veneer of legal process. And that's why the story you're watching isn't just about two names in a headline. It's about what happens when the machinery of justice becomes a stage for personal retribution. In the next, we're going to look at Lindsay Halligan herself, where she came from, how she was positioned for this role, and why her appointment raised eyebrows even before the Comey indictment was unsealed. Because once you understand her, the urgency and irregularities of what happened next start to look far less like incompetence and far more like intent. Enter Lindsay Halligan, the loyalist prosecutor. The first time I saw Lindsay Halligan's name attached to a federal prosecution, I stopped reading, scrolled back up, and checked the date twice. It didn't make sense. Not because she wasn't a lawyer, she is. Not because she wasn't talented, people who've worked with her speak well of her. But because nothing in her background resembled the profile of a U.S. attorney for one of the most sensitive, high-stakes federal districts in the country. Let me walk you through that feeling, because it wasn't political. It was institutional. In most of the United States, the office of the U.S. Attorney is the backbone of federal law enforcement. The Eastern District of Virginia, in particular, is practically legendary. They call it the Rocket Docket. National security cases, espionage, public corruption, cyber operations, white-collar crime involving millions, sometimes billions of dollars. It's the kind of office where prosecutors typically have decades of courtroom experience under their belt before they even sniff leadership. So imagine my reaction when I read that Lindsay Halligan, a former defense lawyer best known publicly for representing Donald Trump during the Mar-a-Lago search, had been dropped into the top job overnight. Let me paint you a picture from my own past to help you understand why that stunned me. Years ago, I watched a colleague, brilliant, steady, respected by everyone, put his hat in the ring for an interim U.S. attorney appointment in a different district. He had 20 years in the building. He had run major cases. He had argued appeals. When the appointment came down, he didn't get it. Not because he wasn't qualified, but because the department wanted someone with even more experience. That is the bar. That is the culture. So when the news broke that Eric Siebert, the previous U.S. attorney, had been pushed aside and Halligan installed in his place, my first thought was, why her? My second thought was, why now? Here's what we know publicly and what insiders were whispering long before this exploded. Siebert reportedly believed there was no viable case against Comey. That matters. Line prosecutors can object, but when the head of the office says we're not bringing this, the conversation usually ends there. It's a signal that the office is honoring the boundary between criminal law and political desire. But then, suddenly, Siebert was out. Trump announced Halligan as the replacement. Within days, she was sworn in. And within hours of that, she began issuing charging documents, not just for Comey, but for New York Attorney General Letitia James. Two longtime Trump antagonists. Two cases the previous leadership had declined to pursue. Let me tell you something that may be uncomfortable to hear. In my entire career, I never once saw a new interim U.S. attorney walk into a building and immediately launch prosecutions of high-profile political enemies on day one. Not once. Because that's not how this process is meant to work. You're supposed to meet with your senior staff. You're supposed to review ongoing matters. You're supposed to get briefed by career prosecutors who have lived with these files for months or years. You're supposed to understand the strengths, the weaknesses, the risks. You don't take a stack of politically explosive cases and sprint to the grand jury before you've even learned where the restrooms in your new office are. Unless, of course, that's the expectation placed on you. Here's the part that really made me pause. Halligan had never been a prosecutor. People hear lawyer and think all legal roles translate. They don't. Prosecution is its own world. It's not about fighting for a single client. It's about representing the United States of America. It's about knowing when not to bring a case. The most powerful thing a prosecutor can do is decline. That's why you normally appoint people who have spent years learning the art of restraint. Because restraint is what protects the system. And restraint is what was missing here. Look at the timing. The statute of limitations on certain charges against Comey was days away from expiring. The DOJ had memos explaining why he shouldn't be prosecuted. Judges had already rejected prior attempts to revive these theories. Yet Halligan walked in the door and moved instantly. Now imagine if you were a career prosecutor in that office, someone who had reviewed the Comey file, someone who had told Siebert the case wasn't viable, someone who believed in the integrity of the process. Suddenly, your new boss has a completely opposite agenda. And not only does she have it, her agenda aligns perfectly with a president who has spent years publicly demanding Comey's prosecution. I've spoken to enough DOJ veterans to know how devastating that moment must have been. Because prosecutors operate on one sacred assumption, that the law, not the president, not the party, not revenge, is the force guiding their decisions. Once that balance shifts, even slightly, it affects everything. Let me paint another picture, this time hypothetical, but rooted in reality. Picture a Monday morning staff meeting. The new U.S. attorney sits at the head of the table. She announces her intent to pursue the Comey indictment. You see a few eyebrows raise, a few glances exchanged. Senior career attorneys shift in their seats because they know the case's weaknesses, the procedural risks, the institutional cost. Maybe someone gently suggests taking more time, reviewing prior memos, consulting Main Justice. Maybe Halligan nods politely, but her mind is already made up. The message is clear. This is happening. And if you've ever worked in a hierarchical institution, you know how paralyzing that can feel. In that room, the chill wouldn't come from politics. It would come from the realization that the safety rails meant to protect the justice system had just loosened. Here's what scares me the most. Once you install someone whose public loyalty to a president is overwhelming, and then hand them the prosecutorial power of the United States government, you've crossed a line we used to treat as unthinkable. And the moment you cross it once, you can cross it again, and again, and again. In the next, we're going to talk about something even more unsettling. The internal DOJ memorandum that already warned against prosecuting James Comey long before Halligan arrived. Because once you understand what that memo said and how it was quietly brushed aside, you'll see why this entire case feels less like law and more like premeditated retaliation. The buried memo, when DOJ quietly said, "No case." There's a moment in every major prosecution where the room goes quiet, where the facts have been debated, the statutes dissected, the politics acknowledged but set aside, and everyone present understands that this isn't just about winning or losing a trial. It's about whether the United States government should move forward at all. In federal practice, that moment almost always produces a memo. A long one. A memo that weighs the evidence, the legal standards, the risks of prosecution, and the potential consequences for the institution if things go wrong. These memos aren't dramatic. They're not glamorous. But they are, in many ways, the moral backbone of the Justice Department. They tell you when the government should step forward and when it should step back. And here's what most people don't realize. Long before Lindsay Halligan ever set foot inside the U.S. Attorney's office, long before the rushed indictment, long before the statute of limitations panic, there already was such a memo on James Comey. A memo that said, "Do not prosecute." Let me walk you through why that matters. When Comey testified before Congress in 2020, he gave answers that were, depending on your political lens, either cautious and parsed or evasive and misleading. Some senators accused him of lying. Prosecutors reviewed the transcript. They reviewed the questions. They reviewed the context, including the fact that congressional testimony isn't a trivia quiz. Legal definitions matter, intent matters, precision matters. I've handled investigations into false statements before. Let me tell you something the public rarely understands. The line between a lie and a technically truthful but incomplete answer is razor thin, and the law treats that difference like a canyon. To charge someone with lying to Congress, you have to prove not just that they were wrong, but that they knew they were wrong, that their answer was material, that was intended to deceive, and that the question itself was precise enough to support a criminal charge. That's why DOJ lawyers who reviewed Comey's testimony came to a conclusion that, inside the department, is actually quite common in these cases. The case was too weak. Not non-existent. Not ridiculous. Just not strong enough to survive the legal and political scrutiny that would come with charging a former FBI director. So they wrote it down. Page after page. Arguments, counter-arguments, citations, precedents. A document meant to be the final word. We decline. Now let me paint a picture of how these memos land inside a U.S. Attorney's office. A junior prosecutor is sent to retrieve it. It's handed over with this heaviness, a little like a coroner handing you an autopsy report. You skim it first to get the shape. Then you go line by line, highlight, annotate, argue in your head with parts of it, not in agreement with others. When you finish, even if you disagree, you respect it. Because the people who write these memos are the quiet guardians of the institution. They're the ones who keep DOJ from being used as the president's sword. So imagine my reaction when I read that Halligan, within days of being sworn in, essentially set that memo aside. Not rebutted it. Not overridden it through formal channels. Not engaged with its arguments. Just sidestepped it. That sent a chill through me I haven't felt since my earliest years in the building, when someone once suggested we revive a politically risky case, and a senior attorney responded with a single sentence that still echoes in my head. We do not make ourselves instruments of someone else's revenge. But that's exactly what this felt like. Let me walk you through the implications. Because they're bigger than Comey. Bigger than Halligan. Bigger than Trump. When a prosecutor discards a memo like that, they're doing more than disagreeing. They are declaring that institutional judgment no longer matters. That guardrails can be removed if they are inconvenient. That the analysis and experience of career attorneys, people who spent years earning their authority, can be bulldozed by a newcomer whose primary qualification appears to be loyalty, not experience. Here's what really scares me. This memo wasn't ancient. It wasn't written in some bygone era. It was recent. It reflected the best understanding of the law by people who had no partisan motive to protect Comey. They weren't fans of his. Many privately criticized his decisions during the Clinton investigation. Their job was not to shield him. Their job was to protect the integrity of the law. And when Halligan moved forward anyway, ignoring that foundation, the entire process shifted from legal proceeding to something more dangerous, legal theater. Because once you disregard the internal analysis, the case becomes about something else entirely. Not whether Comey lied, but whether someone wanted him charged. Not whether the evidence met DOJ standards, but whether someone was determined to deliver a political trophy. Not whether the law was clear, but whether power could bend it. That's why the buried memo matters. That's why it's the fulcrum of this entire story. Because it shows us that this prosecution wasn't born of law, it was born of frustration. Born of a long-standing desire from a former president to see his rival finally brought low. Born of a moment where the usual norms of restraint were tossed aside. Let me paint you one last picture before we move on. Imagine you are a career prosecutor in that office. You've read the memo. You've agreed with it. You've told your boss the case shouldn't proceed. And then one morning your new U.S. attorney walks in, holding a draft indictment, and says, "We're doing this." You look at the memo on your desk. You look at the indictment in her hands. And in that moment, you understand something painful. The institution you swore to defend just shifted beneath your feet. In the next, we're going to talk about the clock, the statute of limitations cliff that created a frantic, pressured environment, and how that rush may have produced some of the most alarming procedural breakdowns I've ever seen in a federal prosecution. Because when timing becomes the master instead of the law, everything else starts to collapse. Racing the clock, the statute of limitations cliff. There's a smell a case gets when it's being rushed. It's something I learned to recognize early in my career, like the scent of ozone before a lightning strike. Agents working late. Conference rooms booked at odd hours. Draft indictments circulating with red lines still fresh. Voices lowered in hallways. That quiet urgency that tells you time isn't just a factor. It's the boss. And in the Comey indictment, that smell was overwhelming. Let me walk you through the timeline, because the timing isn't a side detail. It's the skeleton key that unlocks everything. The statute of limitations for at least one of the charges Halligan brought against James Comey was set to expire in early October 2025. That 5-year clock had been ticking relentlessly since Comey's 2020 congressional testimony. Under normal circumstances, DOJ uses that window carefully, reviewing, debating, analyzing, sometimes shelving a case entirely if the evidence isn't strong enough. But this time, the clock wasn't a safeguard. It was an ultimatum. When Halligan was appointed, she didn't inherit 5 years of breathing room. She inherited days. Days to read in on the file. Days to assess evidence that previous DOJ leadership had rejected. Days to move from newly sworn in to indicting a former FBI director. Days to revive a politically radioactive case that had already been analyzed, declined, and internally documented as too weak. Let me paint you a picture of how that pressure warps judgment. It's late September. The office is supposed to be settling into its normal rhythm. But instead, you've got a brand new U.S. attorney, one with no prosecutorial experience, pushing senior staff for answers at breakneck speed. Can we indict before the deadline? Is the grand jury available? What do we need for probable cause? You can almost feel the tension. The hurried calls, the emails stamped urgent, the sense that this isn't deliberation. It's a race. And races kill good cases. I remember one investigation years ago when we were up against the limitations deadline. We had a defendant we were sure was guilty and a victim who begged us not to let the case die on a technicality. We reviewed the evidence for the 100th time, and the senior prosecutor, one of the best I've ever worked with, sat us down and said, "If we charge now, we'll lose. And losing will do more damage than waiting. The institution has to come first." It was painful. We didn't indict. The clock ran out. The man walked free. But the integrity of the office held. What happened with Halligan was the opposite of that decision. Instead of slowing down, she sped up. Instead of acknowledging the risks, she brushed past them. Instead of engaging the previous analysis, she sidestepped it. And instead of allowing the limitations deadline to be the reason to not indict, she treated it as the reason to charge immediately, no matter how messy the process became. And the process did become messy. Let me walk you through just one example of what that rush produced. When Halligan brought the draft indictment to the grand jury, it reportedly contained 3 counts. The jury rejected one. Under normal procedure, you revise the indictment and bring the corrected version back to the entire grand jury for approval. That's basic practice. That's criminal procedure 101. But Halligan didn't do that. Pressed by a ticking clock, she reportedly got only the foreperson and one other juror to sign the revised indictment. A shortcut so severe that federal judges later questioned whether the indictment even legally existed. That's what racing the clock does. It erodes discipline. It invites mistakes. It weakens cases that needed to be airtight. And above all, it signals that the goal isn't justice, it's beating the calendar. Here's what really scares me. The statute of limitations is supposed to protect all of us from stale prosecutions. It's one of those quiet constitutional principles that keeps the government honest. It ensures the state doesn't dredge up old accusations when memories fade, evidence decays, and fairness becomes impossible. No matter how urgent a prosecutor feels, no matter how politically mouth-watering a target might be, the law's message is simple. If you miss the window, you miss the window. But a prosecutor determined to deliver a politically desirable indictment will see that window not as a boundary, but as motivation to cut corners. Think about what that means for the rest of us. Now imagine this playbook applied not to a former FBI director, but to a private citizen, someone who said the wrong thing online, or angered a local official, or uncovered wrongdoing in a state agency. Someone who doesn't have televised hearings or a public profile. The statute of limitations becomes less a shield and more a countdown clock used to justify sloppiness and pressure. Because when prosecutors race the clock for the wrong reasons, they stop thinking about the consequences for the individual, or the system, or the precedent they're setting. They only think about winning the deadline. That's why this matters. Because the Comey indictment wasn't just flawed, it was hurried. And hurried cases break things. The law, the process, the trust that binds those things together. In the next, we're going to get into the moment everything cracked open. The hearing where Halligan admitted that the grand jury never saw the final indictment. Because what happened in that courtroom didn't just raise doubts, it detonated them. The grand jury revelation, there is no indictment. There are moments in a courtroom when time seems to stall, when the air changes, and everyone in the room knows something irreversible has just happened. I've lived through one of those moments myself. It's the kind of experience that rewires you. You walk in thinking you're arguing a case. You walk out realizing the case is arguing you. That's exactly what happened when Lindsay Halligan stood before a federal judge, tried to explain how James Comey had been indicted. Let me walk you through this slowly, because the details matter, and they matter in a way that most people never fully appreciate. Start with the foundation. In the United States, a prosecutor cannot simply write an indictment and file it like a press release. A grand jury, a group of ordinary citizens, must review the evidence and formally approve the charges. This isn't window dressing. It's the firewall. It prevents the government from hauling people into court on the prosecutor's say-so alone. Grand juries aren't suggestions. They're constitutional machinery. Now imagine the judge's face when Halligan admitted, on the record, that the full grand jury had not approved the final indictment she filed against Comey. Let me paint you the scene as I imagine it, because I've been in courtrooms when similar admissions detonated cases. The courtroom is quiet. The judge asks a simple, almost routine question. Ms. Halligan, did the grand jury approve the indictment that was filed? Halligan shifts. She hesitates. And then she says something close to, "No, Your Honor." Only the foreperson and one other juror signed a revised version. A stillness falls over the room. Defense counsel freezes. A few people exchange looks. The court reporter lifts her head. That stillness isn't confusion, it's recognition. Recognition that something is deeply, structurally wrong. Because here's the thing, the foreperson signing an indictment is normal, but only after the full panel has voted. The signature is the final formality, not the substitute for the vote. What Halligan described was not a formality. It was a bypass. Let me explain why this is so dangerous. When the grand jury first saw Halligan's charges, there were 3 counts. The panel rejected one. That's significant. Grand juries rarely reject prosecutors' charges. The bar is low. If even they said no, it means something wasn't convincing. So Halligan removed the rejected count, revised the indictment, and instead of returning to the full grand jury for approval, she allegedly had just 2 members sign it. That is not how the system works. That is not how it has ever worked. And the judge knew it. I once saw a prosecutor get benched career over because he skipped a required procedural step during grand jury presentation. It wasn't malicious, it was sloppy. But the judge made it clear, when liberty is on the line, shortcuts are fatal. Now imagine that same judge hearing Halligan's admission. Imagine the weight of it. Not a mistake during a hectic week. Not a minor administrative confusion. A breakdown of the very mechanism that determines whether a prosecution is lawful. Here's what really scares me. If Halligan had not been questioned so precisely, this might never have come out. The indictment could have proceeded. The case could have unfolded. The public might never have known that the charges against a former FBI director, one of the most politically loaded prosecutions in modern history, rested on an indictment that had never legally existed. Let me paint you a picture of how defense counsel reacted in that moment, because I've been on both sides of these shocks. One lawyer leans over to another and whispers, "Did she just say what I think she said?" Another flips through their binder, looking for any citation that might help them confirm what just happened. Someone at the back scribbles a note and underlines one sentence 3 times. Lack of grand jury approval? If you've never felt the walls of a courtroom shift, trust me, the shift is unmistakable. The judge pressed further. Halligan tried to clarify. The more she explained, the deeper the hole became. Every sentence seemed to raise new questions. Did she misunderstand grand jury procedure? Did she rush the process because of the statute of limitations deadline? Did anyone in the office object? Did Main Justice know? Or did she know the proper procedure and choose to bypass it? Judges don't like mysteries in their courtrooms. They like clarity. They like precision. And the transcript from that hearing gave them neither. Here's something I wish more people understood about federal judges. They don't need to prove intent to be alarmed. They care about structure, order, legitimacy. And when a prosecutor stands before them and describes a process that cannot be squared with the law, the judge will see it not as a mistake, but as contamination. And once contamination touches an indictment, everything built on top of it becomes unstable. Let me step back for a moment and show you why this revelation was the turning point, the moment the Comey case stopped being merely flawed and became untenable. If the grand jury didn't approve the final indictment, then, there was no jurisdiction. There was no valid charging document. The prosecution lacked legal authority. The case was, in the most literal sense, born dead. Not politically dead. Not morally questionable. Legally non-existent. You could see the defense lawyers realizing this in real time. You could see the judge realizing it. And I suspect, even though she tried to maintain composure, you could see Halligan realizing it too. This is where the train left the tracks. And it set the stage for everything that came next. The walkback attempts, the contradictory filings, the credibility crisis that shook the entire prosecution. In the next, we're going to examine that fallout. How Halligan and the Justice Department attempted to reinterpret or even overwrite that courtroom admission, and how those shifting explanations only deepened the suspicion that something was fundamentally broken in this case. The walkback, the spin, and the credibility crisis. There's a particular kind of silence that hits a Justice Department office after a disastrous court hearing. It's not loud. No one is yelling. No one is throwing papers or slamming doors. It's something colder, heavier. A collective awareness that the narrative has slipped out of your hands, that the facts, once spoken aloud in a courtroom, can't be unspoken. That's the silence I imagine fell around Lindsay Halligan's team after her admission about the grand jury. Let me walk you through what happened next, because this is where the story stops being about procedural errors and starts being about credibility. And credibility in a federal prosecution is oxygen. Once you lose it, you suffocate. The morning after that hearing, DOJ lawyers were scrambling. The transcripts were out there. Defense counsel was sharpening its arguments. Legal analysts were buzzing. Judges were asking questions. And Halligan was faced with a brutal reality. Her own words had created a crisis that no amount of political loyalty could shield. So the narrative began to shift. Suddenly, filings from the Justice Department claimed something dramatically different from what Halligan had said in court. They argued that the full grand jury had, in fact, approved the indictment. They cited a transcript that they claimed demonstrated this approval. They suggested that the process had been mischaracterized, misunderstood, taken out of context. They were trying, in plain terms, to rewrite the moment. Let me paint you a picture of what that looks like from inside the legal system. A prosecutor walks into court and says one thing. The written brief says another. The defense pounces. The judge leans back in their chair, eyes narrowed, realizing that they are now being asked to choose between two conflicting versions of events, both coming from the same government. I've seen that moment before. It chills a courtroom faster than any argument a defense attorney can make, because judges can forgive a mistake. They can forgive inexperience. But they do not forgive shifting explanations, especially when those explanations appear designed to obscure rather than clarify. Let me walk you through why this discrepancy was fatal. In the hearing, Halligan described a very specific process. 3 counts presented, a 1 rejected, revised indictment created. Only the foreperson and 1 juror signed. That narrative aligns with a rushed prosecution, corner-cutting, statute of limitations panic. Then, in filings, DOJ claimed something very different. That the full grand jury had reviewed and approved the charges. That the signatures reflected standard practice. That Halligan's earlier statements should not be read literally. It was not a clarification. It was a contradiction. And contradictions in federal court are like blood in the water. Let me paint you another picture based on a hearing I once witnessed. A prosecutor had made a small but significant error in a prior filing. When confronted, instead of acknowledging it, he tried to clarify his way out of it. The judge let him finish, paused, and then asked a single question that broke him open. "Counsel, which version should I believe, the one you said under oath, or the one you wrote after the fact?" That prosecutor's voice shook when he answered. Because he knew the truth. Once a judge decides your credibility is compromised, your entire case becomes radioactive. That's what happened here. Legal experts watching Halligan's case didn't mince words. They called the walk back unusual. They called it alarming. They called it something no seasoned prosecutor would attempt unless the alternative was even worse. When career DOJ lawyers resorted to referencing a transcript to contradict Halligan's spoken testimony, it didn't repair the damage, it amplified it. It told the court and the public that even the government couldn't keep its story straight. Now imagine how the defense lawyers must have reacted. They probably didn't even hide the smile. Because a credibility crisis in the prosecution isn't a crack in the wall, it's a wrecking ball. And once it swings, you don't get to stop it. The defense can now question every representation the government makes. If the grand jury process was misrepresented, what else was mishandled? If the indictment wasn't approved properly, was any evidence presented properly? If the prosecutor misstated facts once, can any of their explanations be trusted? And the judge, cold, neutral, unforgiving, is thinking the same thing. Here's what really scares me. This wasn't just about an indictment. This wasn't just about procedure. This was about the trustworthiness of the Justice Department in one of the most politically charged cases of our era. Once a judge doubts your honesty, every single filing becomes a test. Every hearing becomes a minefield. Every explanation is parsed for signs of evasion or spin. And by the time Halligan's team submitted its revised narrative, the damage had already been done. Let me show you how judges think about this. They do not ask, is the prosecutor well-intentioned? Is the prosecutor politically aligned? Is the prosecutor doing their best? They ask, can I rely on the government's representations? Can I trust their description of the facts? Can I accept their word when liberty is at stake? If the answer is no, even once, the case is in free fall. And in this case, there wasn't just one judge raising alarms. The second judge, reviewing related filings, expressed similar skepticism, suggesting that the issues here weren't minor slip-ups but deep structural flaws in how the prosecution was assembled. That's the part people underestimate. This wasn't about one bad hearing. It was about a chain of decisions that all pointed in the same unsettling direction. A prosecutor out of her depth, operating under political pressure, making procedural choices that jeopardized the legitimacy of the entire prosecution. In the next, we're going to talk about the moment the bottom finally fell out, the ruling that declared Halligan's appointment itself illegal, wiping out not just the Comey case, but every action she took as U.S. attorney. Because if you want to understand how deep this crisis truly ran, That ruling is the earthquake that reveals the fault line underneath. The bombshell ruling Halligan's appointment was illegal. There are rulings that clarify. There are rulings that correct. And then there are rulings that detonate, quietly, clinically, but with enough force to reshape the legal landscape the moment the ink hits the page. What Judge Cameron McGowan Curry issued in Halligan's case was the third kind. It wasn't just a setback. It was a verdict on the very foundation of the prosecution itself. Lindsay Halligan was never legally the U.S. attorney. Let me walk you through why that matters, because the implications are enormous, and most people outside the legal world still don't fully appreciate what that ruling actually said. Start with the basic architecture. Under federal law, an interim U.S. attorney appointed by the executive branch can serve for 120 days, no more. If the White House wants someone to stay beyond that period, the power to appoint shifts to the district court. It's one of those quiet separation of powers guardrails designed to prevent exactly what the framers feared: a president installing loyal prosecutors indefinitely without Senate confirmation. Now imagine my eyes scanning the ruling as Judge Curry laid out the timeline. Halligan's appointment blew past that 120-day limit. There was no judicial confirmation, no Senate review, no legal authority underpinning her role. She was, in the judge's words, occupying the office without valid appointment at the time she brought charges. Let me paint you the image this creates inside the legal system. Picture a surgeon holding a scalpel, confident in their authority, and then learning mid-operation that their medical license was expired. Even if their technique was perfect, every cut becomes tainted. Every stitch is invalid. Every act, even the ones performed competently, collapses under the weight of the foundational flaw. That's what this ruling meant. Every action Halligan took as U.S. attorney was void, not flawed, not irregular. Void. And that single word, void, has a gravity lawyers feel in their bones. When I first read it, I found myself leaning back, exhaling. Because in one stroke, the judge didn't just dismiss the Comey case. She invalidated the entire apparatus around it. Halligan's leadership, her charging decisions, her grand jury presentations, even her most basic representations, all of it was retroactively stripped of legitimacy. In other words, she never had the badge. She never had the authority. She never had the legal standing to do what she did. Let me walk you through how rare this is. In decades of watching federal courts, I have seen judges scold prosecutors, sanction them, throw out evidence, even dismiss indictments. But I had never seen a judge declare that a U.S. attorney herself, the top federal prosecutor for an entire region, was unlawfully installed. That crosses into a different category. It's not a critique. It's a structural indictment of the executive branch's decision-making. And Judge Curry didn't stop at the appointment itself. She connected the dots. If the appointment was illegal, then the indictments Halligan signed were unauthorized. And if the indictments were unauthorized, then the defendants, Comey, Letitia James, and anyone else who might have been in her crosshairs, were being prosecuted by a person who lacked legal legitimacy. Let me paint you the courtroom atmosphere the moment that ruling was read. Defense counsel sitting still, barely breathing. Halligan's team stone-faced, already imagining the political fallout. A judge reading her opinion in a tone that is not triumphant, not cruel, just resolute. A bailiff shifting uncomfortably, sensing the weight. And at the center of it all, a fundamental truth finally spoken aloud. The machinery of justice had been hijacked by an unconstitutional appointment. Here's what really scared me as I absorbed the decision. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a clerical oversight. This wasn't a technicality someone forgot to calendar. This was a move that extended presidential power into a territory the Constitution explicitly reserves for checks and balances. And the judge, an experienced jurist, spelled that out clearly. The president cannot dodge Senate confirmation by rotating loyalists through interim appointments indefinitely. Because if that tactic were allowed, every president would abuse it. And the line between justice and political force would dissolve. Judge Curry's ruling didn't just extinguish the Comey prosecution. It hammered a stake into the heart of this entire effort to weaponize the U.S. Attorney's Office. It said with legal force, no, you don't get to do this. Not here. Not in this country. Not under the Constitution. But here's the part that kept me staring at the final paragraph long after I finished reading. This wasn't the product of one bad decision. It was the culmination of a pattern, one that started the moment Halligan was chosen, accelerated with the rush to indict, exploded with the grand jury revelation, and collapsed under the weight of this ruling. And yet, even after all of that, the Justice Department hinted at appealing. They signaled that the story wasn't over, that the legal fight might continue despite the wreckage left behind. In the next, we're going to zoom out even further. Because once you see Halligan's appointment as part of a pattern, part of a broader strategy rather than a one-off anomaly, you start to realize that this isn't just about one prosecutor or one president. It's about whether the justice system itself is being repurposed into a political weapon, and whether this ruling was the end of that effort or the opening round of something even more dangerous. Not a one-off or a pattern of weaponized justice. There's a moment when you've been in this line of work long enough where you stop looking at events as isolated incidents. You stop asking, did this happen? And start asking, what does this fit into? Because in the world of federal law enforcement, and especially in the world of political power, nothing truly exists in a vacuum. Patterns are everything. They're how prosecutors spot fraud, how intelligence officers spot infiltration, and how historians spot the first cracks in a democracy's foundation. And when I stepped back from the Halligan mess after the illegal appointment ruling, after the grand jury debacle, after the contradictory filings, I noticed something unsettling. Nothing about this looked like a one-off. Not the choice of prosecutor. Not the timing. Not the targets. Not the methods. Let me walk you through the pattern I see, because once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Start with the obvious. James Comey was not the only person Halligan targeted. The same week she moved against Comey, she also indicted New York Attorney General Letitia James, two high-profile adversaries of the former president, two individuals who had, for years, been fixtures in Trump's political grievances, two prosecutions based on legal theories that had previously been questioned or rejected by DOJ leadership. This wasn't a coincidence. Coincidences don't stack up like this. Let me paint you a picture of the old DOJ playbook. Under normal conditions, when a prosecutor takes down a major figure, especially a political figure, it's because career attorneys spent months vetting the case. Evidence is triple-checked. Precedents are analyzed. Public trust is considered. There's caution stitched into every step because bringing a politically sensitive case isn't just about winning. It's about making sure the country survives the outcome. Now compare that with Halligan's approach. Rushed indictments, questionable procedures, untested legal theories, and a laser-like focus on individuals the president had spent years demanding vengeance against. That's not a playbook. That's a hit list. And the judges noticed. Multiple judges, not just one, expressed concern about Halligan's conduct. They questioned the hurried processes, the lack of prosecutorial experience, the irregular grand jury procedures, the aggressive timelines. I've seen judges go years without making public comments that sharp. For several to do it in the same cluster of cases, that's the legal equivalent of shouting something is wrong here. Here's what really scares me. Halligan wasn't an isolated loyalist acting alone. She was installed. She was empowered. And she was unleashed on cases that career prosecutors had already deemed too weak or too tainted to pursue. That tells you something crucial. The pressure wasn't coming from the bottom. It was coming from the top. And that pressure fits into a much larger, well-documented pattern. A president who openly demanded prosecutions of political opponents. A Justice Department pushed to revisit cases already declined. Officials replaced when they resisted. Legal norms twisted until they snapped. This pattern is not subtle. It's not hidden. It's not coded. It's out in the open. I want you to think about something I witnessed years ago during the aftermath of Watergate. I wasn't in government then, but I trained under attorneys who lived through it. They used to describe the atmosphere inside DOJ as haunted by the realization that a president had tried to turn the Justice Department into a political weapon. The reforms that followed, special prosecutors, ethics rules, appointment limits, oversight mechanisms, were designed to make sure it never happened again. And yet here we are. Now imagine the Halligan episode not as an anomaly, but as a test. A stress test of how much a president could bend the justice system before it broke. How much pressure the walls of the institution could take before they cracked. And how much loyalty could be extracted from public servants by giving them unreviewed power and a clear list of targets. Let me paint you another picture, hypothetical but uncomfortably close to what we just saw. Imagine a president frustrated by legal obstacles. Imagine private conversations where an advisor says, We can't get Senate confirmation for a loyalist, but we can install them as an interim. Imagine lawyers drafting strategies to stretch the appointment clock, to extend authority by technicality, to rotate loyalists through key offices just long enough to issue indictments. This isn't a fantasy. This is exactly the kind of maneuvering authoritarian-leaning governments use as they hollow out their institutions. They don't declare martial law. They don't shut down Congress. They infiltrate the justice system with loyalists too inexperienced to resist and too politically indebted to say no. Halligan wasn't just a misplaced lawyer. She was a proof of concept. Here's what chills me most. Even after 2 cases collapsed, even after judges condemned the appointment, even after the legal community raised alarms, nothing in the broader landscape guarantees that this won't be tried again. Nothing prevents a future president from tapping another loyalist, or another, testing the boundaries over and over until the courts can't keep up. Because this is how democracies erode, not through one dramatic collapse, but through a steady pattern of bending until the metal finally snaps. And if you think this pattern ends with Comey or Letitia James, you're missing the larger story. Those cases were the warm-up act. The first attempt to turn prosecutorial power into a political tool. And the ruling in Halligan's case, as powerful as it was, only addressed one node in a much larger network of pressure and ambition. In the next, we're going to shift from the corridors of power to the lives of ordinary people. Because patterns like this don't stay at the top. They trickle down. And the moment the justice system becomes a weapon, it's not just people like Comey or James who are in danger. It's all of us. The human cost, what this means for ordinary people. When you talk about prosecutions of people like James Comey or Letitia James, it's easy for the story to feel distant, abstract, like it belongs in the realm of political chess rather than human life. But let me tell you something I learned a long time ago. When the justice system bends for the powerful, the shockwaves don't stay contained at the top. They travel downward, quietly, relentlessly, until they land on the backs of ordinary people who never saw them coming. Let me walk you through why this scares me in a way no headline ever could. Because Comey will be fine. Letitia James will be fine. They have lawyers with pedigrees longer than most resumes. They have platforms, donors, reporters, watchdogs. They can push back. They can afford to wait. They can survive a bad faith indictment. Most Americans cannot. I remember a case early in my career. A middle-aged mechanic, quiet guy, 2 kids, a mortgage, was charged in a sprawling investigation because he'd inadvertently handled equipment linked to a fraud ring. He wasn't part of it. He didn't know the players. His only mistake was being adjacent to a crime. He didn't have political enemies or powerful friends or a story worth putting on television. He was just unlucky. During his arraignment, I looked over at him and saw a man whose entire world had just collapsed. Not because he was guilty, but because the federal government pointed a finger at him. His employer suspended him. His bank froze his line of credit. His wife cried quietly in the back row. Even after we eventually dismissed the charges, his life was never the same. Neighbors looked at him differently. His kids were teased. He lost work. He lost trust in the system. And part of me believes he was right to. Now imagine that same power, the power that unraveled that man's life, being exerted not by cautious prosecutors who second-guess every filing, but by political loyalists, rushed deadlines, and improvised processes. Imagine that the target isn't a celebrity name or a former FBI director. Imagine it's someone with no visibility, no lawyer waiting by a phone, no newspaper demanding answers. Let me paint you a picture. Imagine a small-town journalist. Call her Dana. She writes an expose about corruption in a sheriff's office closely aligned with a governor or president. A loyalist prosecutor, recently installed in a district, opens an investigation into Dana's sources. Subpoenas start flying. Her hard drives are seized. Her reputation is smeared as under investigation. Charges are filed on a flimsy legal theory normally laughed out of a courtroom. The indictment is rushed. Evidence is thin. But the process itself is the punishment. Dana's employer distances itself. Her family panics. She spends tens of thousands on legal representation she can't afford. In the end, maybe a judge dismisses the case. Maybe she's cleared. But the damage is done. She is financially gutted, emotionally exhausted, and her community views her through a permanent haze of suspicion. Now imagine that because Halligan's approach wasn't stopped, someone else picks up that playbook. A prosecutor in another state, or another administration, or another ideological faction. That's the risk. Not the prosecution of one former FBI director. The normalization of a tactic. Let me give you another hypothetical, because sometimes imagination is the only way to grasp the danger clearly. Picture a school principal, an immigrant well-liked, active in local politics. He publicly opposes a state policy. At a rally, he criticizes the governor. Someone close to the governor wants him silenced. An ambitious local prosecutor sees an opportunity. They open an investigation into the school's funding paperwork. They comb through email logs looking for inconsistencies. A minor administrative oversight is turned into an allegation of fraud. A grand jury is convened. The principal is indicted. He's not wealthy. He's not famous. Within weeks, he's out of a job. His career is ruined. His community, confused by the legal noise, turns its back. His kids hear whispers at school. The case drags on for months before collapsing for lack of evidence. But the human cost? Permanent. This is not fiction. Versions of this have happened in other countries sliding into competitive authoritarianism. Once prosecutors become political weapons, the first targets are high profile. The second wave is mid-tier opponents. The third wave? Ordinary citizens who get in the way. Here's what really scares me. Halligan's prosecutions were so brazen, so sloppy, so rushed that we almost lulled ourselves into believing they couldn't happen again. But incompetence is not what makes this dangerous. It's the intent behind the incompetence. The willingness to bend law to desire. The eagerness to use prosecutorial power as punishment. Because if someone else, someone more disciplined, more strategic, were to refine that playbook, it wouldn't look chaotic. It would look systematic. Now imagine a scenario 5 years from now. A city council member tries to expose environmental corruption. A whistleblower reveals that a contractor overbilled a state agency. A community organizer leads protests against police misconduct. Each of them finds themselves dealing not with disagreements, but with subpoenas, raids, indictments crafted to intimidate rather than convict. This is the slippery slope. This is the warning. And this is why what happened to Comey and James matters for people who will never appear on a ballot, never testify before Congress, never trend on social media. Because once powerful people realize they can aim the justice system at their enemies, they eventually aim it at anyone. I'll tell you the moment this clicked for me. It was years ago. I was sitting in a cramped office with an old mentor, one of those career DOJ attorneys who carries the ethical weight of the institution like a second spine. We were discussing a politically sensitive case. At one point, he leaned back, sighed, and said, "People think the danger is that we'll prosecute the wrong powerful person. The real danger is that we'll prosecute the wrong powerless person." He was right. He still is. In the next, we're going to project forward to imagine what happens if this becomes the new normal. Because if you think Halligan was the peak of this threat, you haven't yet seen what the future could look like if the wrong hands learned the right lessons from this case. Now imagine this becomes the new normal. There's a point in every crisis where you stop asking, "How did this happen?" and start asking, "What comes next?" Because the real danger isn't the scandal itself, it's the precedent it sets, the machinery that gets built, the permissions it quietly grants, and the terrifying possibility that the next person who picks up the same tools will be smarter, smoother, more disciplined, and far more effective than the one who came before. Let me walk you through a future that keeps me up at night. A future that isn't speculative fiction, but the logical continuation of what we just saw. Start with the simplest shift, normalization. When Halligan's appointment was exposed as illegal, when her indictments collapsed, when judges scolded the procedural breakdowns, the political world treated it as either a victory or a witch hunt. No, it's just another fight. But imagine a slightly different scenario. Imagine a future administration watching the Halligan debacle not with embarrassment, but with curiosity. Okay, they might say, "So we can't violate the appointment rules that blatantly. But what if we find a workaround? Maybe we use the Vacancies Act differently. Maybe we rotate 3 loyalists instead of 1. Maybe we pressure the courts to confirm someone quietly. Maybe we learn from the mistakes and do it cleanly." This is how norms collapse. Not all at once, inch by inch. Let me paint you a picture of the America that emerges on the other side of that inching, because I've seen versions of it abroad, in countries that slid into what political scientists call competitive authoritarianism. That's the stage where the forms of democracy still exist. The elections, the courts, the press, but the substance has been hollowed out. Now imagine a crisis moment. A real one. A domestic terror attack. A cyber assault on critical infrastructure. A contested election. Something that strains public trust. And in the middle of that crisis, imagine a president who believes the real threat isn't the external attacker, but the domestic critics. The journalists digging too deep. The governors refusing to comply with federal directives. The whistleblowers revealing contradictions. The judges issuing inconvenient rulings. In that environment, the temptation to install loyal prosecutors, quietly, strategically, is overwhelming. Now imagine this. Scenario 1, the midnight appointments. It's 2 a.m. The country is distracted by a fast-moving national emergency. The president uses statutory loopholes to appoint several acting U.S. attorneys in key districts. No Senate confirmation. No public vetting. Each one is a known loyalist with an ideological mission. By sunrise, subpoenas are being drafted. Political opponents are receiving target letters. A few well-timed indictments land on social media before breakfast. No tanks in the streets. No soldiers. Just paperwork. Scenario 2, the weaponized bureaucracy. A future administration learns from Halligan's mistakes. They select loyalists who do have prosecutorial experience. People who know the rules well enough to bend them without breaking them publicly. They use subtle legal theories. Civil enforcement actions. Grand jury investigations that last years. Cases that never intend to convict, only to drain resources, intimidate, or delay. Imagine a governor trying to run for president while being pulled into court once a month to answer vague allegations of misuse of state funds. The case never goes to trial. It never needs to. The process is the penalty. Scenario 3, the quiet purge. Picture a second-term president who instructs DOJ to review the actions of federal judges who ruled against them. They can't indict judges directly, that's a bright red line. But they can indict clerks, former law partners, staffers. They can freeze communications, seize devices, pull metadata, intimidate, and chill. A judge who once ruled bravely now thinks, is this worth it? Is this ruling going to drag someone I care about into a federal courtroom? That's how autocracies don't announce themselves. They emerge. Let me walk you further into this future. Think about cities. Picture an ordinary American city, not New York or D.C., but someplace like Omaha or Raleigh or Tucson. A place where federal prosecutions quietly shape lives. Immigration cases, gun cases, drug cases, fraud cases. Now imagine that office is being run by someone whose loyalty is to a political leader, not to the law. Suddenly, certain neighborhoods are targeted more aggressively. Certain activists mysteriously find themselves indicted. Journalists are warned by anonymous sources that their names came up in a federal meeting. A local politician who opposes the administration becomes the subject of a grand jury probe that seems to go nowhere but never ends. You don't need a dictator to destroy democracy. You just need a prosecutor with the wrong incentives. Now let me make it more personal. Imagine a future where your child's school closes because of environmental contamination. You organize parents. You file complaints. You get loud. And then one day an envelope arrives. A letter informing you that you're being investigated for financial irregularities related to your parent-led fundraiser. Your bank account freezes. Your employer gets nervous. You can't afford a lawyer. You start wondering whether speaking up was a mistake. That's how authoritarianism arrives, through fear of involvement. Here's what really scares me. Once a tool is invented in politics, it never goes away. Once a loophole is found, someone will exploit it again. Once a tactic is tested, someone will refine it. And once prosecutors can be weaponized against political enemies at the federal level, they will be weaponized at the state level too. Then at the county level. Then in school boards. Then in city councils. Because the easiest way to silence dissent is not through violence, it's through paperwork, through indictments, through investigations that drain time, money, and hope. Too many Americans comfort themselves with the belief that the system will stop it. But systems don't stop anything on their own. People do. Judges, prosecutors, whistleblowers, journalists, citizens. And if enough of those people are sidelined, intimidated, replaced, or simply worn down, then the system becomes whatever the person in power wants it to be. In the next, we're going to look at the fragile safeguards that barely held this time, and why we cannot count on them holding forever. Because the Halligan episode may have ended with a judge's ruling, but the forces behind it are still out there, still evolving, still watching. And the next tests may not end so cleanly. The fragile safeguards, judges, insiders, and whistleblowers. There's a comforting myth we tell ourselves about democracy, that the system will save us, that the institutions we inherited, courts, agencies, watchdogs, are sturdy enough to withstand whatever political tempest hits them. But after everything I've lived through, and everything we just watched unfold with Lindsay Halligan, I can tell you something hard and honest. The system didn't save us. People did. Few of them. Just enough of them. And if even one piece of that fragile human chain had failed, this story might have ended in a very different place. Let me walk you through the safeguards that held, barely, and why depending on them again would be an act of faith we cannot afford. Start with the judges. Most people imagine federal judges as distant, robed abstractions, philosophers with gavels. But the truth is, good judges are the last line of defense in moments like this. They don't carry swords. They don't command armies. Their power lies in saying one simple word, no. What Judge Curry did, declaring Halligan's appointment unlawful, wasn't just a legal interpretation. It was an act of institutional resistance. She read the statute. She read the Constitution. She looked at the timeline. And she said the thing many were afraid to admit: the executive branch had crossed a boundary, and she was not going to let it slide. And she wasn't alone. Remember, another judge had already signaled deep unease about Halligan's grand jury process. The third raised concerns about basic procedural honesty. Judges don't coordinate their skepticism. They don't swap notes. They see what's in front of them. And in this case, the alarms were loud enough that multiple jurists, independent of one another, recognized the same rot spreading through the foundation. But judges cannot act on instinct or outrage. They act on facts. And facts only reach them because of something else: insiders. Let me paint you a picture of what those insiders look like, because they're not the people you see on cable news. They're the assistant U.S. attorneys who stay late, reading transcripts no one will ever praise them for. They're the paralegals who notice that a signature page looks off. They're the court clerks who quietly flag discrepancies. They're the agency lawyers who whisper to colleagues, "This isn't right. Someone needs to say something." Most of them will never be named in public. But I promise you this, without a handful of career DOJ professionals refusing to put their names on Halligan's paperwork or refusing to bless her interpretations, the cracks would never have been visible enough for judges to intervene. Let me share something personal. Years ago, I watched a senior DOJ official block a questionable prosecution. The agents were furious. The politicians were impatient. The public wouldn't have cared either way. But the official said, "If we do this once, we will do it again, and again, and then we'll forget how to stop." That phrase haunted me as I read the Halligan transcripts, because it is people like that, people who understand the slippery slope instinctively, who keep the system from veering off a cliff. And then there are the whistleblowers. I don't mean the heroic, cinematic kind. I mean the quiet resistors, the staffers who leak just enough information to alert investigators, the attorneys who speak candidly when questioned under oath, the analysts who refuse to massage numbers, the career civil servants who tell the truth even when it's inconvenient. I've been in rooms where someone's honesty saved the day. And I've been in rooms where someone's silence nearly destroyed a case. It's easy to imagine the Halligan saga unraveling because of some dramatic revelation. But more likely, it unraveled because a handful of people, in the right moments, in the right rooms, refused to play along. Maybe they told investigators the grand jury hadn't reviewed the revised indictment. Maybe they revealed that concerns had been raised internally. Maybe they simply didn't push back when a judge's questions pointed toward the truth. And here's the thing nobody wants to admit: the safeguards that saved us this time were improvised. Human. Fragile. Dependent on the particular integrity of a few individuals who were in the right places at the right moments. What happens the next time if The judge is less assertive, or the staff is more intimidated, or the prosecutor is more skilled, or the White House is more subtle, or the public is more distracted, or the insiders are more scared. What happens then? Let me paint you a darker picture, one I hope stays hypothetical. Imagine the same situation unfolding under a more disciplined administration. Imagine they pick an interim U.S. attorney who does have prosecutorial experience, someone who knows grand jury rules inside and out, someone who is loyal but careful. They don't trip procedural wires. They don't contradict themselves in court. They don't leave memos lying around. They move slowly, methodically, under the radar. In that scenario, who catches the wrongdoing? What judge has a clear hook to intervene? What insider feels safe enough to resist? What whistleblower sees enough evidence to speak up? This is why the phrase "the system worked" is naive. The system did not work. People worked. And people are fallible, frightened, overworked, underpaid, and often politically pressured. And yet, despite all of that, enough of them held the line. It reminds me of something an old federal judge once told me over lunch. I had just finished a tough hearing, one of those days where everything felt like it was collapsing. He looked at me and said, "The law is not a set of rules. It's a set of people willing to enforce the rules." I didn't understand it fully then. I do now. In the final, we're going to face the question that all of this leads to. What do we do with this moment? What does it demand of us? Not as partisans, not as spectators, but as citizens who have to decide what kind of country we want to live in before the next crisis comes. Because the choice is no longer theoretical. It's here. And it's ours to make. The choice we're being forced to make. There's a moment in every long investigation, legal, political, or personal, when you finally stop cataloging the details and step back far enough to see the shape of the whole thing. And when I stepped back from the Halligan saga, from the Comey indictment, from the rulings and the transcripts and the scrambled walkbacks, I realized something simple and heavy. This was never really about James Comey. It was never really about Lindsay Halligan. It wasn't even about Donald Trump, not in the way most people think. It was about the country. Let me walk you through what I mean. Everything we just explored, the illegal appointment, the rushed grand jury, the weaponized timing, the contradictory explanations, the judges forced into the role of constitutional firefighters, was not the story of a single rogue prosecution. It was a stress test, a test of how much pressure our justice system can take before the metal begins to warp. And we just learned something that should keep every one of us awake at night. It doesn't take much, just the wrong people in the right places for just long enough. We watched an unqualified loyalist get installed. We watched long-standing DOJ norms get bulldozed. We watched the walls of the institution bend and creak. We watched the court step in only at the very last second, after enormous damage had already been done. And here's the truth that's been sitting in my chest throughout this entire story. Next time, the system might not hold. Because systems don't protect themselves. People protect systems. And people are exhausted, distracted, polarized, overwhelmed. Many are afraid. Many are cynical. Many, on all sides, are numb to abuses that would have been unthinkable a decade ago. Let me paint you a picture of the crossroads we're standing at. On one path, we treat this as another partisan scuffle, another gotcha moment, another fight to cheer if it hurts our political enemies and jeer if it helps them. We fold it into the noise. We forget the details. We shrug off the warning signs. We pretend the institutions will fix themselves. That path is easy, comfortable, and deadly, because that's how democracies slide, not through dramatic coups, but through a steady drip of normalization. A prosecutor installed here, an indictment weaponized there, a grand jury shortcut overlooked, a ruling appealed until it loses its meaning, a public that stops paying attention, a political class that realizes the norms they once feared violating can now be shattered without consequence. You don't need a tyrant to lose a republic. You just need enough people to stop caring. But there's another path, harder, less glamorous, more uncertain. It's the path where we admit that what happened here matters, not because of the names involved, but because of what their story reveals about the fragility of our system. It's where we decide that weaponizing justice, no matter who does it or why, is a line we refuse to cross. It's where we demand more, not from our enemies, but from our own side. It's where we remember that laws are only as strong as the people willing to defend them. And yes, that path is uncomfortable. It requires self-restraint, accountability, oversight. It requires that we treat abuses of power with the same urgency, whether they come from someone we support or someone we oppose. It requires that we stop asking, "Does this help my side?" and start asking, "Does this strengthen the democracy my children will inherit?" Here's what really scares me, and also, strangely, what gives me hope. The safeguards that held in this case were people. Judges who were willing to say no, insiders who weren't willing to cut corners, whistleblowers who wouldn't stay silent. These individuals weren't superheroes. They weren't perfect. They weren't always courageous. But they were enough. And if we want to prevent the next Halligan, the next weaponized prosecution, the next slow erosion of justice, then we have to empower those people. We have to protect them. We have to listen to them. Most of all, we have to be willing to recognize when something is wrong, even if it benefits the people we like. Let me end with the thought that's been haunting me since the moment I finished reading those transcripts, the line that felt like a hand on my shoulder, pulling me into the deeper truth of this entire story. If prosecutors become weapons, then sooner or later, every one of us becomes a potential target. That's the choice in front of us now. Not red versus blue. Not Trump versus Comey. Not loyalist versus institutionalist. But weaponized justice. Or the rule of law. And in the months and years ahead, every moment, every institution, every crisis will push us toward one of those two futures. We still have time to choose wisely. But we don't have time to hesitate. This is an imagined political thriller story, not a real classified leak or inside intelligence.